Callum, why are people talking about the minimum wage right now?
People are talking about the minimum wage now really for two reasons. One is that governments all over the world are becoming very keen on having a higher minimum wage. And the second reason is there is this growing body of literature from economists which finds that minimum wages have hidden costs.
As someone whose first job was pre-minimum wage, £2.92 an hour in central London, I would say that's a great thing. Minimum wages are rising.
It is a great thing for lots of people, absolutely. It raises the wages of employees at the bottom of the labour market. I think what the other research shows kind of quite clearly is that the employment effects of minimum wages are quite small. So there was this belief among economists, Milton Friedman being the classic example, who would say, if you have a high minimum wage, it will price the youngest people and the people with the lowest qualifications out of the labour market. That has not really happened. The unemployment rate across the rich world is pretty low, and the employment rate, so the share of people who are actually in a job across the rich world, is actually at an all-time high. So there haven't been these consequences that some economists had foreseen.
And yes, I can feel a but coming.
There is a but coming. I think there's kind of two buts to think about. The first is, are there other effects of having a higher minimum wage on people's jobs? So a job is not simply a question of how many hours you work or do you work in a job. It comprises a bundle of different things, pay, conditions. And then the second thing we can talk about is it the best way to fight poverty and inequality if that is indeed your goal as a government?
And what does the research suggest?
So on the first one, on the question of the kind of non-employment effects of minimum wage, these are actually kind of a lot worse than people had previously thought. And there is now this growing body of research which essentially says if you have a high minimum wage, it's right to expect that you won't get a big jump in unemployment. So that's good. On the other hand, it does seem likely that it will reduce the quality of work in other ways. So, for example, there's a very interesting new paper that was published recently which shows that when minimum wages go up, workers' schedules become a lot less predictable. Workers are essentially more likely to be told at the last minute, oh, we don't need you to come in this week, or we don't need you to come in today. Now, that's a bad thing. There's also other evidence which suggests that when you have a high minimum wage, workplace safety often gets worse. And the theory behind that is when employers are being forced to pay more, they basically push their workers harder and they push them to cut corners, and this leads to more accidents and that kind of thing.
And more profoundly, is it the best way to fight poverty?
This is, I think, the most interesting question. And there's a sort of like a left-wing critique of the minimum wage, which is you might think that by having a high minimum wage, you're achieving progressive policy goals. But in fact, the evidence really suggests that that is not the case. Often minimum wage workers are in fairly high income families. So what you're doing when you're increasing the minimum wage is say the rich kid who has a summer job, he or she will get a nice salary boost over the summer, but that family doesn't particularly need the extra income. And it's actually very surprising when you look at the kind of micro data on this, just exactly who benefits from the minimum wage. It's often not the people that you think that will benefit from it. Often people at the very bottom of the income distribution are either not in work at all, so they can't see any benefit from the minimum wage, or they're in jobs which pay above the minimum wage, but they have a partner who doesn't work, say. So the mapping of an individual's salary onto their household income is actually surprisingly indirect. So the way that you would want to reduce inequality, if that's your goal as a government, is basically pay poor households more money. And you can achieve that through the welfare state. And what you've actually seen, particularly in the UK, is a retreat of that kind of policy and a move instead towards a policy of higher minimum wages. And in fact, having a situation where you have a very generous minimum wage, but a much less generous welfare state is actually not that good at reducing inequality or poverty.
So the idea that work pays actually isn't good for overcoming inequality?
I guess your conclusion could be that it's no bad thing to have a minimum wage of some level. I think that there are clearly instances where you want to try and level out the imbalance of power that exists between some employers and some employees. So having that wage floor is a good idea. However, beyond that wage floor idea, which I think is what the evidence would suggest is quite low, if your goal as a government is to reduce inequality, then the best thing to do is to have a more generous welfare state.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Callum.
Thanks, Rosie.